Good afternoon. I'm Tom Platt with the Washington chapter of the Society for Range Management. Welcome to our second quarterly presentation of 2023. Today's topic is historical overview of the BLM and public lands grazing in the United States. It's part two, presented by Ken Visser. Ken retired from the BLM in 2016 after a 37-year career as a range management specialist. He presented part one in November 2022, and you'll find the recording of that presentation, plus several other past quarterly presentations on the Washington chapter YouTube channel. Just browse to YouTube and search SRM Washington. And with that, Ken, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll turn the screen over to you.
Thanks, Tom. I already blew it. I need to share screen first.
Correct.
And okay, I'm going to have to go through like 70 years pretty quickly here. So where we left off last time was right at the 40s and the 50s. Recall, we came all the way from having no organization whatsoever on BLM lands to the Taylor Grazing Act to the initial adjudication of permits on the range in the 1940s. So,
yeah, excuse me, would you like to start that slideshow?
Yeah, I'm looking to see where I want to start, and I think I will start at slide 41. So, how's that?
Thank you.
Now, okay, there we go. So we combined. So the General Land Office and the Grazing Service were combined right after World War II by executive order by Harry Truman, and it was way different than origin of something like the Forest Service, which had its own organic act going back to all the way to 1905. So the very first logo of the Department of the Bureau of Land Management showed kind of its a mission as it envisioned itself. You can see the surveyor, the timber, the miner, the cowboy, and the coal miner all looking forward to using the lands out in the 50s. Now, in the 50s, we just had the war ended, and we had a lot of college-educated GIs coming back from, well, we had GIs coming back from the war and getting college educations. The GI Bill allowed many former servicemen to go to college. And by the late 1950s, the BLM could and did hire men with professional degrees in range science and professional affiliations in the Society for Range Management. They were by no means antagonistic to grazing, but they brought more critical scientific tools to range management. These range conservationists began to reevaluate grazing areas through new professional range surveys, and these surveys revealed that more than 20% of the rangeland was in poor condition and that reductions in grazing use were necessary. This was a cause of conflict and stress between the stockmen and the BLM. Grazing levels up to now had been pretty much set by the stockmen. The stockmen, in this particular example that I'm showing on the screen, McGraw Flat, the controversy was in fact over what are called paper AUMs. The BLM wanted to remove, the ranchers at the time weren't really raising up to their full allocated numbers under their permit because they were aware too that the feed just wasn't there. And so they were trying to, the BLM was trying to bring the allocation, the permits in line with what they felt was the true allocation out there. However, the stockmen fought it and hired an attorney The ranchers, in this instance, contacted the US senators from Wyoming, state senators, and officials of the National Livestock Association. In the Wyoming, members of the National Livestock Association talked directly with the director of the BLM. And then the ranchers used the most commonplace and perhaps the most effective postponement tactic of all. They called for a resurvey. This was successful, and there was time for they were able to politically fight off these grazing cuts. However, that didn't make the problem go away, and we had pressures for grazing reductions further increase, and there was a preliminary study and report on frail watershed lands in 1964. This also indicated that erosion and overgrazing were significant issues on BLM lands in the West. Now, post-war prosperity and more leisure time increased human flows onto the public domain, national forests, and national parks. A flow which eventually became a flood between 1960 and 1965. Recreation use on lands administered by the BLM doubled. I'll call your attention to that open desert land race right there. Those were common back then. In 1962, Assistant Secretary Carver warned the American Cattlemen's Association that true multiple use management is far from a refuge for the cattlemen. It is the gate through which competing users enter, which was the stockman's domain. He predicted that recreation would eventually dwarf livestock grazing in terms of both political and economic significance. Now, this next slide has to do with the re-adjudication of the range and the fact that McGraw Flat was politically controversial, but there was plenty more of that political controversy going on in the West. So rather than, and recall that I said in the McGraw Flat one, what did they wanted to do? They wanted to get rid of AUMs that existed on the permit but actually weren't reflected on the ground. What the Department of Interior did in the 1960s was create this category of use on grazing permits called suspended non-use. So this allowed BLM to go forward and make promises and saying, look, there's not enough forage out there right now to cover what you have in your permit. What we'll do is we'll suspend the difference between what we think is there and what is actually there, and it'll still be recorded on your permit. And this is valuable, and it's still valuable to the ranchers because bankers don't really understand, I don't know, the SIMRA, that is suspended use AUMs. Anyway, I happened to run across and find this in searching for a different regulation, because in the BLM, it was like, where did the suspended use come from in the first place? Well, here it is. At the time, too, the assistant secretary testified for the regulation change in front of, I forget whether it was Congress or appropriator or whoever, some committee. He said he anticipated that these suspensions would last for 3 to 5 years. And we still have this suspended non-use or suspended use on our permits today. This is a sidelight too of another aspect of BLM grazing administration that's called fenced federal range. It doesn't exist in the on the books. There's nothing referring to it in the grazing regulations. It's a way of trying to take care of an awkward situation where if you look at the land pattern, this is the creek that was settled during the time of homesteading and all that, where they settled the lands, got patents to them, and then, blocked them up. However, they're not going, there wasn't any pretty much any oversight during, the development out there. And so we would have fencing situations where they needed these pastures, et cetera, and they just fenced them like this. Well, that stuff in the yellow is still BLM lands, and it's still the public's land to manage, but it's behind and managed in along with a private land. And so for the range specialists now, it's sort of a source of confusion. And if we explain this to them, how they should be dealing with this fence shuttle range. If in fact we had some, for right now, the policy is sort of laissez-faire for this stuff inside these fences. But if we were to, BLM was to learn that there was a special value or threatened or endangered species or some archaeological thing going on there, we could assert control and take that on. Okay, more on the controversy of the early days of the BLM. These early managers, I can't believe how, they must have had ulcers up the wazoo for all the work they had to do in order to try to get these lands, which had been overused and abused for so long, trying to get them to some reasonable capacity. So anyway, this is the book. If you're interested in this sort of history, it's called The Battle of Soldier Creek, and I believe it's Oregon centric, so it's worth looking into if you like history. Okay, so again, with all this controversy, they thought, well, maybe what can be done? What solutions do we have? And I don't know how many of you have heard of the Vail Project, but it was a large project in Oregon that was, well, I'll just read from my notes. The Vail Project was a grand experiment to increase the productivity of degraded rangelands. In the end, the Vail Project completed 506,000 acres of brush control, sagebrush mostly, 267,000 acres of seedings, 72,000 miles of fence, 1,600 water developments, and 460 miles of water pipelines. AUMs in the district increased, animal unit months of forage in the district increased from 285,000 in 1962 to 438,000 in 1975. An important tool of the project was to increase forage availability by putting water into dry places that had grass but were never used, and to create seedings for early season use to give native rangelands some growing season deferment. Because of this era, BLM was often derisively referred to as the Bureau of Livestock and Mining. At the onset, the Vail Project was not without its detractors. Strong opposition was voiced. Was it environmental groups wanting to save sagebrush or a teeny plant animal? No, it was the ranching community. They wanted the scope of the project limited to water developments. Crested wheatgrass was unknown and untested, and they favored the reliable cheatgrass, not some radical government idea that wouldn't work. $10 million in 1960s money, adjusted for inflation, is around $100 million today. What could we do with $100 million today with no NEPA, ESA, cultural or botanical surveys, public input, etc.? The thought of limitless natural resources was displaced over the past 60 years by the wise use and preservation philosophy. Then came Rachel Carson's 1962 book. It represented a watershed moment It sold more than 500,000 copies in 24 countries. Her book raised public awareness and concern for living organisms, the environment, and the link between pollution and public health. She questioned the wisdom of many things, including the unforeseen consequences of the Vail Project's use of herbicides. Her book came about while the standard problems of the day were things like the Cuyahoga River in Ohio being so polluted it caught fire for the 12th time in less than 85 years. Air pollution was commonly accepted as the smell of prosperity. President Johnson's administration was between Carson's book and the first Earth Day. In that period was the passage in 1963, the Clean Air Act, 1964, the Wilderness Act, 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act, 1968, the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. In 1964, following on the Forest Service Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960, came the Temporary Classification and Multiple Use Act, set to expire in 1970. It required BLM to examine public domain lands and their resources and to classify them for disposal or retention in federal ownership and multiple use management. It was the broadest delegation of discretionary authority yet given to the BLM. And recall, all during this time, the BLM and BLM themselves looked at themselves as caretakers of these lands, pending their eventual disposal.
Ken,
So,
Ken,
yeah.
may I interrupt you for a question?
Okay.
The question is, with respect to FFR category, can you comment on the management status code attached to allotments as compared to FFR? For example, I'm looking at a permit that notes the allotment management status code as improved category, and the management status code for the FFR in the permit are uniformly custodial category. Can you explain what the intended management difference is?
The FFR is the the relatively little pieces. I'm assuming that there's, Big Smith allotment and then Big Smith allotment FFR. The Big Smith allotment is in the improved category, and it's primarily BLM lands. And the Big Smith FFR category allotment is that piece of those little pieces of BLM land that are fenced in with the rancher's much larger private land within that particular grazing unit. So because of the fact that it is FFR and we're not going to invest the money to realign the fences or do anything of that sort, and that we have so much land to manage and so few people and resources to do it, we have to set priorities. So the FFR inside with the private is going to be custodial, laissez-faire, look over the fence now and again, a kind of management, whereas the improve is intended to establish that allotment as having a priority for planning purposes and investments in the future.
Thank you.
And I imagine too, whoever asked the questions, that it's there's separate lines on the permit. And so anyway, so now the BLM is going into planning. Now, as a precursor, FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of '76, which we'll get to, really was our BLM's organic act. But this was the first act for the BLM to start pulling together land use plans and saying, yes, we need to discover all what's possible on these lands and try to balance these uses as best we can. In 1965, the BLM changed its logo. BLM split the difference between no limits and no uses. This director, Charles H. Stoddard, said, "This triumvirate of soil, water, and vegetation are the elemental constituents of the public lands. They were chosen to depict multiple use with unimpaired productivity." And then there's some other historical stuff. BLM started to refer to them as National Reserve lands, but that name didn't stick, and they just sort of like let it fade away. Okay, now we're coming into the late 60s and the early 70s. As the post-war baby boomers came of age, environmental concerns and the social consciousness increased. By now, concern over the environment was less introspective, more driven to action, even radical action. For example, sabotage, the Monkey Wrench Gang, Earth First. Government responded to the public, meaning those who vote, and created the Environmental Protection Agency and passed a series of environmental acts. 1970, National Environmental Policy Act. 1970, major revisions to the Clean Air Act. 1971, the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. 1972, Clean Water Act. 1973, the Endangered Species Act. So this is contrasting now to just where it was 20 years prior, where we have now laws being expressed through Congress, and it's setting the agency up for being what do I want to say? We're the middle people. We have people on one side who want something and people on the other who want the other, and we're the ones who are supposed to find the middle ground. So this is where it comes closer to my tenure in the agency. As you recall, I need to back up a bit. In NEPA and grazing, the 1970 National Environmental Policy Act required the federal government to disclose to the public significant impacts to the human environment caused by major federal actions, hence an environmental impact statement. How do you know if it's a major federal action, and how do you know if the impacts are significant? You complete an assessment to determine if you need to write an EIS, so you write your EA. The NEPA process is intended to help public officials make decisions that are based on understanding of environmental consequences, take actions to protect, restore, and enhance the environment. BLM attempted to meet its NEPA obligations regarding its entire livestock grazing program by completing one national, quote, programmatic level EIS. The proposed action was to maintain status quo or increase livestock production. One document for all grazing in the BLM. That's from Canada and the snow line to Mexico, and year-round grazing, from the plains to the Pacific Ocean. In 1974, the National Resources Defense Council sued the BLM and demanded more specific analysis of the grazing program and greater balance among grazing and other public land uses and values. Ultimately, the suit was settled. Under the agreement, BLM would prepare 144 individual EISs for all range management activities covering 150 million acres by 1988. Between 1978 and 1989, BLM completed 142 EISs on the grazing program, covering around 175 million acres. I was hired in 1979 as for inventory crew to do rangeland inventory to support the Wells resource area, which is outside of the Elko district, the Wells resource area, environmental impact statement, and land use plan. Coming back to the slide, the NRDC settlement, however, did nothing to address BLM's low budget, small workforce, lack of data, and lack of management authority. BLM was still operating under the legal sentiment of land disposal. In 1976, BLM finds its purpose, sort of. So classical BLM grazing management is going along, which involves developing allotment management plans and designing and implementing range improvements, farming our way out of grazing conflicts. Now, if the Department of Interior had been called the Department of Things in General, BLM could certainly be called the Bureau of Leftover Bits. All the land worth settling had been settled. All the good forested lands were managed by the Forest Service, with the exception of the ONC in Oregon, which was a different story. All the fancy wildlife areas were managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All the showy landscapes were managed by the National Park Service. Mapping, researching, and science were for the USGS. Indian lands were managed by the BIA. Dams and power were managed by the Bureau of Reclamation. The Department of Defense withdrew any land it needed. All the stuff not managed by those guys was to be managed by the BLM. Laws that were science-based had been passed. Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, the National Park Service Organic Act. Laws that were procedure-based had been passed, NEPA, multiple uses, sustained yield, so forth. How is this agency to make progress? And progress towards where? Where were we about other than livestock and mining and land disposal? How were all these environmental laws supposed to fit? Were we first, second, or third wave driven? Well, that's on previous lectures. So I won't go there. So in 1976, the bicentennial year of the Declaration of Independence, on October 21st, came the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. This is often considered BLM's organic act, but it did not create the agency or establish the territory. After 30 years of operating as the public lands custodian under statutes inherited by the GLO and the Grazing Service, what FLPA was a new start. The act states plainly that public lands will be retained unless BLM decides otherwise through our planning processes. Congress directed the BLM to keep and manage the land and delegated authority to the agency to dispose of lands through a public process. FLPA shifted BLM's purpose for existence from the Bureau of Livestock and Mining toward Gifford Pinchot's 1905 Forest Service mission of the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. But FLPA added, on a sustainable basis. And I have much more notes on this, but I don't have time. So now we're going for a struggle for control again, as referenced in part 1 of this back in November. But now it's lawyers and lawyers and ranchers and environmentalists and BLM and miners and you name it. Prior to FLPA in 1976, use of the public domain was controlled largely by the extractive industries. Conservationists, environmentalists, preservationists, recreationists, and others were largely locked out. They had no real voice on how things were to be done. Thanks to FLPA, every possible demand for use of the public domain is to be considered, even no uses at all. The chiefly valuable concept was cost out. BLM no longer classifies lands and their chief values. Use of public lands was now open for public debate. In the 1880s, attempts to control the use of the public domain came from political wrangling, hired guns with threats and use of violence. Now, attempts to control the use of the public domain comes from political wrangling, figurative hired guns with threats and use of litigation. Two changes happened in 1978 as a reaction to FLPMA. The Public Rangelands Improvement Act was a supplement to FLPMA that enabled ranchers to counter gains made by the environmental community earlier in the decade. As FLPMA's required land use plans began to reveal the need for grazing reductions up to 40%, PREA came along to encourage avail project type solutions to improve the ranges, to increase the available forage, and improve means to farm our way out of the problem once again. The funding of $345 million over the next 20 years was short of the BLM's requested $2 billion. Excuse me. More lasting, however, PREA also set forth a temporary fee formula for the grazing fee for the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service for the years 1979 to 1985. And that fee formula is still pretty much, in essence, the same as it was then. Let's see, 1978 Code of Federal Regulations. This is a second thing that happened as a result of FLPMA. The grazing regulations received a major overhaul since the early 50s to reflect incorporation of FLPMA, stating from now on, grazing use would be guided by land use plans that balanced competing uses. And they made some changes in terminology, and they did some other things too that were important, like these are, in this talk, I'm not even talking about all the grazing lands in Alaska, so we'll save that for another day. But these lands, it used to be that the General Land Office let me start over. The General Land Office also had grazing leases. The Grazing Service administered grazing permits. The grazing leases were based on a lease amount. You would rent the land per acre. So I can't go into real detail about grazing leases, but the point of what I'm trying to say right here is that the 1978 Code of combined the permits and the leasing regulations into one set of regulations. We still have grazing leases and grazing permits, but they're more uniformly administered now. Many in the agency thought that with FLPMA's vastly expanded purpose would come a vastly expanded budget. It did not. To the extent possible, there was a swelling in the ranks of specialists, realty, archaeology, wildlife, fisheries, soil scientists, botanists, etc. This was a time when BLM hired a great many range conservationists to conduct inventory. The number of range conservationists in BLM peaked in the mid-80s at 850, and since then has been almost halved, now closer to 350. Many folks began their BLM career in this time period and are often referred to as FLPMA baby. FLPMA required BLM to make and manage a complete vegetative inventory of the public lands. BLM created SVIM, the Soil Vegetation Inventory and Monitoring Method. It was the birth of vegetation classification, now known as ecological site descriptions. BLM SVIM not only classified the vegetation communities, but also estimated the carrying capacity. BLM also conducted wilderness character inventories and created wilderness study areas. Back then, we were a multiple disciplinary organization one made up of many related disciplines, but not necessarily working together for a common outcome. Often the various disciplines worked against each other. Successful implementation of a non-range project often depended working in secret and finding ways to go around those in the range program. Successful range projects needed to go around or run over the concerns of the wildlife folks. The only real activities that any political horsepower were still grazing and mining. In general terms, range folks hated sagebrush. We wanted to kill it and plant crested wheatgrass. Wildlifers hated crested wheatgrass and wanted to kill it and plant native species. Range folks wanted to dig out that spring and pipe the water to a trough. Wildlifers wanted to keep the cows off the spring and let the water grow grasses and forbs on the meadows. The cow was king, so was the range program. Wildlife issues were an annoyance, and wildlifers were the clowns. Sagebrush Rebellion was a movement among Western states to claim ownership of the public lands and to challenge the federal government's growing regulatory role in the public lands. And those of you who attended part one will recall that during the Hoover administration, the states were tacitly offered whether or not they wanted to take over these federal lands, and the states did not. They turned them down. So I guess people don't remember. 40 years before, the states didn't want anything to do with the public domain, let alone owning it. Now they're claiming it as their own. In short, it was a reaction to the implementation of FLPMA. States like Nevada claimed federal ownership was a violation of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which declared that a state carved out of the territories, quote, shall be admitted on equal footing with the original states. Politically, that rhetoric had some traction, but legally it was a dud. Equal footing has to do with equal representation in Congress, not the equal amount of federal ownership of lands within the state. Western complaints were about issues such as the East unduly controlling the West, federal bureaucracy unduly controlling individuals, in absentia environmental groups unduly controlling local communities. These complaints were based on the lessening of home rule on the range. This was an industry pushback to environmental advances. President Reagan declared himself a sagebrush rebel. President Reagan appoints James G. Watt as Secretary of Interior. Secretary Watt helped set the tone for the executive branch's new attitude when he called environmentalists a, quote, left-wing cult. In the incoming administration, BLM Director Robert Burford ordered that changes in grazing use would not be made on a point-in-time inventory that was conducted pursuant to SVIM, but only after multiple years of monitoring. Out the window went the SVIM effort, and onto the shelf went the data. President Reagan issued Executive Order 12548, which indefinitely extended the Public Rangelands Improvement Act grazing fee formula with a minimum floor of $1.35 per AUM. I think that's all for that. However, Secretary Burford did issue this 1987 secretarial order regarding riparian areas. It read in part, the objective of riparian area management is to maintain, restore, or improve riparian values to achieve a healthy and productive ecological condition for maximum long-term benefits. This was a 180-degree shift from the past 184 years of riparian management. Prior to this, the wet areas were sacrifice zones, first to get beat out. The fundamental tenet of range management was to manage for the 99% of the land base in the uplands and right off the 1% in the riparian areas. The Western public lands grazing industry was built on the model of feed cows on meadows in the winter, open gates in spring, and let cows follow the green to the top while you stayed home and put up hay. stock watered on snowmelt reservoirs in the springtime, and used the cool mountain creeks in the heat of the summer. When the cool fall weather warned of coming winter, stock would wander home. Ranchers would have put up their hay by then, and they would gather the stock as they came out of the hills. But starting in 1987, grazing management outside the home place now required major changes. The 1987 Secretarial Order of Managing for the 1% of the most critical land based caused the formation of understanding riparian, cause for a new science to understand riparian areas. But managing for riparian areas in light of FLTMA was a new trick for the BLM. The agency didn't even know what we had in terms of riparian areas. We never looked at them in any meaningful way. And this caused the birth of the proper functioning condition assessment. Proper functioning condition assessment is a one-time rapid qualitative non-statistical inventory to help you key in on problems so you know what needs improvement and what to quantitatively monitor with statistical confidence. Remember, these changes were all written within less than the lifespan of your permittee, or 11 years since the passage of FLTMA. Stockman's request for federal oversight on the range took 44 years, or half a lifetime. Once regulation on the range began, it took 35 more years to finally issue 10-year term permits. Now, in 11 years, things went from we don't want it, we want to dispose of it, to we want to keep it, and now manage for the 1%. Through the 80s and 90s, BLM launched several initiatives: Range of Our Vision, Fish and Wildlife 2000, Recreation 2000, so forth and so on. Range of Our Vision was a 1990 policy plan to increase healthy condition on 75% of riparian areas, increase good condition range from 33 to 40%, and decrease poor condition range from 16 to 10%. Also, there were several, at this time, General Accounting Office reports. And I say this time because under Bush 2, the name of this office was changed to the Government Accountability Office. But back then it's called the General Accounting Office. So several reports came. With these reports does not come more money or more incentive to give the BLM more money. They still have to fight for every dollar. So let's look at some of the quote unquote range of our vision results. Increased good condition range by 2009 from 33% to 40%. The RIME report is a rangeland inventory and monitoring and evaluation report, which is intended to track where we are, where the BLM is relative to its efforts for inventory and monitoring and evaluation. So it's a summary. So if our goal in 1990 was to increase good condition range from 33 to 40%. In 2011, 21 years later, it increased to 2%. To 35%. Same for decreased poor condition range by 16% to 10%. 21 years later, it was decreased to 15%. NEPA and grazing part 2, home wash. Now I'll diverge into when I first became a field range con, we just routinely reissued grazing permits. And we did this without doing NEPA or without reevaluating any of that. We said, we have our grazing EIS, we have our land use plan, it calls for range of grazing permits. So here you go, here's another permit. The comb wash, the BLM changed all that. In 1992, 5 years after the secretarial order on riparian, Utah BLM Moab District San Juan resource area issued the grazing permit for the Comb Wash allotment. From 1978 regs forward, no term grazing permit was required, only an annual authorization, meaning a grazing bill. Comb Wash had been grazed under a series of annual authorizations before a permit was issued in 1992. The issuance of the permit was appealed by the National Wildlife Federation and Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. The case was joined by the permittee and several livestock industry groups. And then there's quite a bit of detail and more detail than I want to get into here, but in essence, the appellants showed that the rangeland management program for the Moab district did not have site-specific information or analysis regarding the impacts of grazing on the resource values of the Comb Wash alone. It contained only general information regarding the impacts of grazing on the entire resource area, which was so generic it could fit any place in northern Arizona or southern Utah if you change only the names and the places and the allotments. The BLM appealed to the Interior Board of Land Appeals. In 1998, the Interior Board of Land Appeals upheld the administrative law judge. BLM did not lose this case due to the range specialist's lack of riparian training, nor was any of the agency data questioned. BLM did not lose because it made the wrong decision, nor did the court find that it made a bad decision. BLM, the appellants, had established a high correlation between grazing and poor riparian conditions. BLM never discussed the issue, let alone made an informed decision that the benefits of grazing outweighed the costs. The appellants could not point to any specific examples of damage to archaeological sites attributed to grazing, but they established that the possibility was high. The BLM lost because it did not take any look, let alone a hard look, at the impacts caused by issuing grazing permits. BLM failed to address competing resources, uses, and values. BLM lost this case because it did not follow its own procedures. And for those of you who, well, this is pretty obvious. The work product for these analyses is like 5th grade math. You can get the right answer, but you'll fail the test if you don't show your work. 1994 range reform. A blue ribbon panel report was published in 1994. From there came proposed changes to the grazing regulations in 1993. BLM called this range reform 94. It was part of Clinton's Reinventing Government campaign. Others called it part of Babbitt's War on the West. One of Babbitt's goals was to turn the Bureau of Livestock and Mining into a premier conservation agency, one where the land was more important than the users of that land. To do this, he needed to sweep out the old guard and bring in new ideas. BLM underwent a major structural reorganization, while other bureaus, for example, the Bureau of Mines, were done away with entirely. BLM had been a 3-tiered organization with a state office, a district office, and a resource area, but each state was allowed to define how it was going to become a 2-tiered regulation. To facilitate the removal of the old guard, a buyout for early retirement was authorized. And it worked for many older pre-FLTMA employees and a few FLTMA babies. 8 of the 12 state directors were replaced in 3 years. Only 1 state director remained from the previous administration. The vacancies created in the upper ranks and the organizational restructuring across the agency resulted in the appointment of many non-traditional managers and leaders. No longer were managers mainly made up of former range specialists. Now many managers had non-grazing background, planners, wildlife biologists, fisheries biologists, fire suppression, realty, recreation, and some with no BLM experience. Rangeland reform brought new regulations as well. Regulations made several major changes. Grazing advisory boards are replaced with resource advisory councils. Affected interest changes to interested public. Affected interest in the old regs were somebody who is interested and affected. The interested public is anyone who expresses an interest in how the lands are managed. Being affected is not necessarily the criterion for being an interested public. A new section was added to the grazing regulations, fundamentals of rangeland health, and standards and guidelines for grazing administration. Allotment management plans became de-emphasized, yet grazing had to ensure we're going to meet the new land health standards, was evaluated on a watershed or landscape basis rather than allotment by allotment. If grazing was an issue, you had a firm deadline to fix it rather than endless monitoring. Reduced AUMs would no longer go into suspension. It was not outright stated in the 1995 range rules that BLM was going to de-emphasize monitoring, allotment management plans, and range improvement planning, but that this resulted from shifting work priorities to rangeland health assessments to support permit renewal actions that needed NEPA support. BLM worked with new resource advisory councils to develop standards and guidelines for rangeland health. Indicators of rangeland health was developed to serve the same purpose as properly functioning condition, but for uplands. And if the health of the land was the goal, the BLM would have to shift from being a multidisciplinary agency to an interdisciplinary organization. Traditionally, adversarial disciplines had to collaborate to even define what healthy land should even look like, let alone how we get there. We needed to learn how to pull together. In an attempt to break away from being a multidisciplinary agency to an interdisciplinary agency, BLM invested heavily in training employees on how to communicate and collaborate with one another. It was like a collective marriage counseling session. While not directly related to grazing management, in 1996, President Clinton designated the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. It was the first BLM national monument and the first multiple use national monument. Secretary Babbitt asked President Clinton to leave it under BLM management to give the BLM a chance to prove its conservation capabilities. The monument would be a place where BLM could continue to honor most existing uses, but subordinate them to ecosystem and landscape protection. This monument was not requested by the BLM, nor was BLM ever consulted on the idea. President Clinton wanted to unveil it as a surprise. Babbitt's request to leave it with the BLM was therefore a surprise, even to the BLM. Typically, if lands were nice enough to be managed like this, they would, find their way to become a monument, and then perhaps eventually a monument managed by the National Park Service, and then maybe eventually a park. President Clinton just designated 14 national monuments totaling 5 million acres. However, the additional areas designated were not proposed in secret, plus there were well-known nice spots in the BLM. BLM often did not publicize their existence for fear of losing them to the National Park Service. Babbitt arranged for the new monuments to have their own appropriations and a full-time staff, and to further institutionalize the monuments within the BLM mission and culture. He created the National Landscape Conservation System. The National Landscape Conservation System includes over 886 federally recognized areas, 27 million acres of national monuments, national conservation areas, wilderness study areas, wild and scenic rivers, national scenic and historic trails, and conservation lands of the California desert. The various new monument designations did not lead to a paradigm shift in BLM management towards ecosystem management. BLM considered ecosystem management as either the latest name for traditional multiple use management or as a lofty and unrealistic goal that could not take root in the agency's existing statutes, regulations, and appropriations. Given the cultural and political foundation of wise use, management of ecosystems first was difficult to accomplish. The Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument Manager learned that BLM lacked the political power to put the land before the land users when trying to impound and trespass livestock on the monument. This particular side, well, I'll have to read it. IBLA's 1998 ruling upholding the ALJ's order for comb wash came about. We needed to complete a review under NEPA before we issue a permit or lease. How many grazing permits reach their expiration date or expired in every given year? And were they grouped together within the same watershed, which allows for 1 EA per watershed? And would the permits meet the goals of ecosystem management when they were renewed? The Stockmen's Association saw the impossibility of the situation and lobbied Congress. Congress responded to this logistical problem in 1999. In appropriation legislation that year, Congress granted a waiver to the NEPA process for permits and leases that expire, so the agency could automatically renew them while it worked on land health assessments, NEPA documents, and permit renewals in priority areas. The waiver was expanded a year at a time until 2005, when it was extended until 2009. BLM's top priority for grazing became grazing permit renewal. To expedite the process, the land health assessment plans in the name of ecosystem management was whittled down to land health assessment plans that only addressed livestock grazing, then renewed grazing permits before the congressional waiver expired. 2009 came and went, and BLM was nowhere near renewing all the grazing permits compliant with range health standards. Not only did BLM fail to get them all done the first time, some of the ones they did first were reaching their expiration date. Any permit we properly issued 10 years before, we would need another review before we could reissue it. The congressional exemption was extended again a few years at a time. In spring 2003, under a new administration, BLM developed market-based grazing administration and management tools for BLM ranchers and citizens to use to sustain working landscapes. We developed things like reserve common allotments, grass banking or forage banks, rangeland conservation partnerships, voluntary allotment restructuring, landscape habitat improvement. I happen to be in DC and worked on this. Actually, if you look closely at this slide, that's me right there. This was working with folks from think tanks, DC think tanks that had interests in the West and Western land issues, among many things. But the one person who worked with, who was pushing this politically was worked for the Cato Institute. And I worked and consulted with him in coming up with some of these policy proposals. In 2006, we did to counter what many in BLM saw as impractical or illogical provisions in the 1995 range reform regulations. For example, public involvement at the field level, a 1-year timeline to complete a 3-year NEPA process, and so forth. In July 2006, the Bush administration promulgated administrative and procedural changes to the grazing regulations. BLM argued that public participation at all levels was inefficient and unfair to those most directly and economically affected by the federal land management. Critics claimed that These changes were a rancher wish list. Plaintiffs sued the National Wildlife Federation and the Western Watersheds Project, sued in Idaho District Court, claimed that BLM's NEPA analysis of the changes were based on doctored science, similar to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doctored science kerfluffle that occurred at the same time frame. Livestock industry joined the suit to defend the changes. The Idaho District Court determined that the rulemaking process contained fatal procedural errors, NEPA, and in 2008 permanently enjoined them from being implemented until BLM cured the court-identified deficiencies. BLM subsequently abandoned the effort, while the livestock industry pursued the case through the Ninth Circuit, where they lost in 2010. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear their appeal in October 2011. As a result, BLM uses the October 1st, 2005 version of the regulations. If you, in fact, go to the Code of Federal Regulations on the web right now, you will see this version of them there, because there never has been a change. Currently, the BLM is working on a regulations change, grazing regulations change again, and this has to do with the fact that FLPMA was amended, and I'll get to that in just a few minutes. I'm almost done. How much time do I have, Tom?
Well, Ken, if you're almost done, just continue on.
Okay. In other words, BLM lost this case, regulations, because the BLM failed to follow its own processes, not because it made the wrong decision. And I'll just cut through trailing permits, which turned out to be, used to be BLM just issued a trailing permit. And it would be done, at the beginning, where they had to trail somewhere of the season or the end. And it was like, a lot of times it was on established trailing routes, so forth and so on. At some point, the decision was made that, well, these should be subjected to NEPA as well. And that, I don't know. So we're getting overwhelmed with all this kind of work. So then with the Obama administration, we start moving back, going back towards the other way. And then this order was an attempt to flip back what Secretary Norton did and expand across the BLM values played on Utah's land with wilderness characteristics. This order was rescinded after industry and congressional backlash. Latest developments: the greater sage grouse. Okay, well, big effort has been put into conserving the greater sage grouse. I think we're probably all in this call are familiar with that, so I won't belabor it since I'm pretty much out of time. Okay, so what the heck does the National Defense Authorization Act have to do with anything? Well, it amended the FLPMA. If you recall those extensions that BLM got for grazing permits because of the logistical difficulties of getting permits all through the process, timely with the budget and staff available. So this Defense Authorization Act permanently amended FLPMA. So we're allowed to categorically exclude trailing if under certain circumstances for for issuing trailing permits. It kind of extends the exemption for the logical thing to do when a permit or lease expires, and typically is you have no more permit or lease. Well, that's unacceptable, obviously, to a long-term rancher. So this protects their ability to get BLM to issue them a permit or lease while they still work on the NEPA, the Rangeland Health Standards, riparian evaluations, so forth and so on. So actually, Tom, that pretty much, do I have 2 more minutes left?
Well, you did about 5 minutes ago, Ken, but if you can wrap up in 2 minutes, we're going to go with you.
Okay. Heard a lot of over the years of, oh, BLM lands don't matter for federal forage, so forth and so on. So I looked into that a while ago. This is a statistic that shows the general decline from 1953 to 2012, 2013 actually, of the number of AUMs sold and the number of authorizations issued across BLM land. You may be aware of this off-quoted statistic based on 1987. BLM and the Forest Service together provide 2% of the total feed consumed by beef cattle in the 48 contiguous states. And that may be true. One type of feed is forage, but also includes other corn, other grains, sorghum, silage, etc. Most of the corn grown in America is fed to animals. And the finishing animals in eastern states and Chicago yard, feeding lots, etc. So let's look at the regional need for federal forage. What percent of Western beef producers need federal forage to meet their livestock needs? A fifth of Western beef producers need federal forage to fill their forage needs. And this, you know, you have to understand the year-long, which I think we all do on this call, the year-long cycle of forage needs for a rancher. What percent of all forage eaten by beef cattle in the US is supplied by BLM and Forest Service lands? A quarter, that's not insignificant. A quarter of all forage eaten by beef cattle in the United States is produced on Forest Service and BLM lands. What states producers rely the most on federal forage? Arizona. They need it to supply about 60% of their year-round forage needs, and the least is Montana. Further reading, and this is the last slide, Tom. If you want to know where some of this information came from, besides my own research, research of my colleague, then these would be the books. Opportunity and Challenge, the story of BLM, Crossing the Next Meridian, Home Range on the Rule, the nation's largest landlord. And with that, I see there's some stuff in the chat box. Did I miss anything?
Oh, let me check, but let's.
I'm done. So thanks for listening.
Well, Ken, thank you very much for an excellent historical perspective on federal grazing in the United States. Let's take a few questions before we adjourn, if there are any.
I don't have another question, but just Ken, thank you so much for putting this together over the time. And I think it's a treasure trove of information you've pulled together. I really appreciate hearing it firsthand from you.
Thank you.
Well,
yeah, it was, I'm trying to unshare, but I don't know what to do. Oh, I'm going to stop share. Okay, Tom?
Yeah, that's fine, Ken. Any other comments or questions? That's a good finale, Jeff. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We recorded this presentation. We'll post it on the Washington chapter channel on YouTube. I would expect by early next week we'll have that posted. Our next quarterly presentation will be by Craig Madsen on the Wednesday, the 16th of August. He's going to talk about soil sponge and ecological function. And I'll also remind you that the BC chapter is going to host the PNW section of SRM's as summer tour and meeting in Cranbrook, June 21st through 23rd. So you can go to the pnw.org to find out more about that meeting and to register. Again, thank you very much. You did a wonderful job of bringing this history to us.
What are the daylight hours in Cranbrook going to be on the summer solstice? That's probably gonna be
Yeah, we'll be there.
18 hours of daylight.
Well, it could be close to that. Yeah, yeah. All right, well, hope to see you all there. Thank you.
All righty, thanks.